Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I tell you, I'm honored to be here. It took me a little while, but I got up here. You know, one of the things that I enjoy, and I've been teaching real estate since the mid-'90s. One of the things I enjoy about the inverse purchase and the techniques that we're teaching right now nationwide is the fact that when I come into work, I'm expecting to get emails not saying, hey, this isn't working for me, you know, this doesn't work, and I got a problem, and we got this, and we got that. But I get emails saying, hey, John, I just closed my first deal, I made $5,000. I just closed my first deal, I made $20,000. I just closed my first deal with $60,000. That's what I'm used to every week. That's why I love this business. I love this technique. This is, it's a great time to be taking and using this information because it is something that is not out there. We basically, everybody is starting to use this method right now, has a monopoly that nobody else is using out there. No other investors are using this method. And so that's an added benefit, of course. But quite frankly, you know, I have people in the same city. I don't have a problem putting 6, 10, 20 people, active people, right in a small 2 or 3 zip code area where I'm working the same transactions because I do the same thing. I don't have a problem with that because there's so much business out there using this technique because we're not going after some big equity spread like where we have to buy a property at 50 cents on the dollar or 30 cents on the dollar or 70 cents on the dollar. You know, especially in this market right now. I mean, if you can just get in there and make a little bit of money, you're doing good with sellers. And so one of the great benefits of this method is that we're able to get in there and not beat up a seller trying to take all their equity, but rather get in there and make enough money for us where we're walking out of the deal with 10,000, 15, 30. If we get a really motivated seller, we can make a lot more. I've got guys making over $100,000 on transactions, and not just every once in a while. That's every transaction they do. If I'm in a transaction, when I do the same technique, I won't even touch the deal for less than $100,000. That's what's got to be on the transaction. So that's the equity I'm going after. But again, I'm strictly working in a really minute area to do that. You know, the longer you're in it, the more money you make. Funny thing is, as somebody starts using the program and start using the technique, they never know what they're going to make. They might make $5,000 on their first transaction, or they might make $30,000. You don't know. Just whatever happens to, you know, you negotiate as you go in, and you talk to a seller and find out, oh, well, I'm willing to let you make this much money. And that's exactly what happens. They make that much money. So what we're going to do today is go through the technique. I'll describe into detail so that we understand what we're going to be doing, the steps to put it together, some psychology about basically what's happening in the transaction because that's some of the techniques I've developed over the years doing this. And a lot of these techniques also have come from my own students who took my basic idea and improved it and said, hey, John, you know, if you just twist this up or you do this, it just makes it a lot easier. So we got 5 years of that coming back in. And, you know, people volunteer information back to me all the time. And a lot of that's because we've helped them make an enormous amount of money. Some of our people are making in excess of $1 million a year in cash, not notes, not on paper, not in equity, but in cash. I'm going to start out today with just some basic history on title seasoning. I'm kind of a mortgage guy. I started, of course, with no background in real estate at all, just like most people. I didn't have a clue, and I was scared to death my first transaction. Pick up the phone and try to make a deal happen. I was so nervous and everything. I couldn't even get it out right. And yet, 30 days later, I made $130,000 profit. And at that time, I said, you know what, this is the way to go. Well, that was like I was 22, so it was about 26 years ago. So I've just continued that process, and it's worked well for me. And in the early 90s, I'd done a little bit of everything in real estate, of course, but in the 90s, I started to realize that, well, in the late 80s, we had a little bit of a hiccup in the market, and real estate went in the tubes. Well, you know what, when the bubble burst, which it did in '87, I was a builder at the time I got slaughtered. If the bubble bursts right now, the builders are going to get slaughtered, real estate agents are going to get slaughtered, but your investors who are not basically holding on to property, but rather flipping property, they're going to make a mint. We're making a mint right now, but when this bubble bursts or the market starts to soften a little bit more, we're going to make even more money. The reason why we're able to make bigger profit spreads because sellers will allow us to come in there and make bigger profit spreads. And I was a mortgage guy. I got started in the 90s understanding mortgages because I realized in that last bubble burst, the key to buying and selling properties and making money in real estate was in the financing. It wasn't necessarily what we've all been told. Well, it's when you buy a house. That's where your money's made. There's an argument for that. But what I found out, the key to making money in real estate is being able to control the financing and to be able to work with people with problem credit. I've been working with people with problem credit since 1982. If you come to me and tell me you've got a credit rating, or you want to look at my house and you've got a credit, I won't even waste my time talking to you. I'll send you down the road. I'm looking for a specific target, somebody who really needs some help getting into a home, and will work through my system. So a lot of what we teach is control from that aspect. We control the financing, we control a buyer. If we control financing, we control a buyer. We're controlling $200,000, $300,000, or $400,000 because that's the loan amount that buyer will qualify for. And it may be $100,000 in some areas. All right, so when you control that much money and you control it month after month on numerous people, that's where the money's being made. So all you have to do, if you've got somebody who needs you to put this money together for them, and you got all these sellers out here who are willing to let you step in and make $10,000, $20,000, or $30,000 on a transaction, that's all you need. You just put them together, step out, you take your cash at closing. So that's the inverse purchase method, and a lot of people were actually doing that. We started teaching and doing note business in the 90s, and I became a mortgage broker back then to learn even more about the financing side and got into the note sales and all that stuff. And the object of the game is that as investors, we don't want to use our money and we don't want to use our credit. And this method does exactly that. The reason why? We're going to use the problem credit buyer's money and their credit. We're even going to use their earnest money. So there's nothing out of our pocket going in to a transaction. One of the things that happened along the way, because some investors, when we were teaching the note side of it, we started to realize, hey, you know what? We can basically put this deal together just like I laid out. We can find some seller who's willing to sell us a house at a lower price, bring in a buyer that has trouble getting a loan. And the reason we were able to do that is because we found a good niche subprime broker. And a subprime broker, mortgage broker, means somebody who specializes in granting problem credit loans to somebody struggling. So what we do is we find this great mortgage broker, lender, originator, whatever you want to call it, and we bring these parties together, but not quite. We step in the middle and keep control of the money and the loan. So that's the basic idea of why we can control that. But on the title seasoning issue, what happened is, and again, people were making money. They would simply find the seller, find the buyer, put it together, and they would basically buy the house, close on it, and resell it to the buyer at the same time. And this is called a simultaneous close. You're doing two transactions at the same time. Well, what happened was the lender started getting hit by these illegal flips, people scamming them and creating false IDs, false appraisals, and all this stuff. And they came out with this new policy. And it applies to everybody, and every lender now has it. It started in about 2000, and that's when everybody started getting shut out of flipping properties using this method. But what they say now is that if you want to sell your home, Mr. Seller, you're going to have to be on title for an entire 12 months before you can resell that to anybody. The only other way you can do it really is to do a lease option. So that's the only option somebody has. If you just buy a property, you've got to stay in it now for 12 months because the lenders won't let you sell it because they won't grant a loan to anybody trying to buy the property as they come in. So we've got this as a title seasoning issue, and this is 12 months for most lenders. South Star, which is one of the other subprime lenders that we'll be utilizing, they actually have a 24-month seasoning issue. Now, we've been teaching this method for 5 years, and we use all these lenders. We're in, we're out, we flip, we pull the money out. None of them have a problem with it because we don't violate their rules. We stayed right within the guidelines of the rules, which comes back to why I was a mortgage broker. Got into it and realized if you could understand the financing and understand how the lenders think and what their rules are, then you can construct the transaction in order to continue doing this. So that's what I did in order to figure out, okay, how do we do this? And that's what I put together, and that's the inverse purchase. So I was able to get around the title seasoning issue. When that occurred, I had all these investors who were doing it, and not necessarily that we taught them, but a lot of people were doing it. They were buying and flipping properties back before the year 2000. And some of them, on average, the ones I talked to, would make $250,000 a year doing it, in all cash. Well, by the year 2000, that door slammed shut, and they all found themselves broke. Well, a lot of them came in and took our training and went right back out and started making even more money because the rules eliminated all the other investors that were doing it. So now only a handful of people were doing it. The title seasoning issue is still there. It's not going to go away. They still have fraud. You still have illegal flipping going on. Lenders are very upset about it. And basically there's two types of flipping. The word flipping, though, in general, is a bad word now. And we can't even use it as investors out in the public. We're talking to a title company or real estate agents or other investors or attorneys. If you use the word flip, they automatically assume, oh, you must be talking about that illegal flip I've been reading in the newspapers. All right, but there's a difference between flipping. There's nothing wrong with flipping. People flip properties every day. We all know that. Investors are out there doing thousands of transactions every week, flipping properties. But they're doing it legally. Usually it's a rehabber. He buys a house, hard money, tries to pick it up at 50 cents on the dollar, gets that loan in there, knocks it out, repairs it, and then he resells it immediately. FHA will limit him now, I think, to, is it 90 days now before he can flip it? Other lenders, they don't care. Some of them will let you flip it 2 days, 1 day after you close on it. So if you're fixing up a property, title seasoning issue is not a problem for you. But the problem with rehabs is, gee, that's like work. You have to actually go out and actually do something, and you're dealing with employees that are going to steal your blind, not show up for work. You've got to actually go out and get a hard money loan. That's your credit. That's your money. The points you have to pay, making somebody else rich usually. And you've also had to find that property to begin with, which is tough. But then after you do all of that, now you got to put it on the market and hope it sells. Because every month it doesn't sell, you owe another payment. And so these are the negatives out there with rehab. And there's some positive sides to rehab. I'm not knocking it totally, because sometimes if you get a really nice big profit spread, hey, it's worth it. All right? But I just have a problem with working too hard. That's just way too much work. I'd rather sit on my phone and show up for a showing and go home and be done with it. That's my idea of working. So so flipping is not illegal. Other flipping that's being done, you can create notes at closing. These are owner carried notes. I'm not going to go into that now, but we do that also. We can create a note at closing. That's a note between you and a buyer. That note can be sold at closing to an investor who will fund the entire transaction. That money goes to pay off the seller. So that's a flip. All of these are legal flips being done every day, and if you ask a title company, they have no problem with the transaction. You describe the transaction, they have no problem with it. You use the word flip, they sometimes will look, some of the ones that aren't really well educated working with investors will look at it and say, what kind of flip are you talking about? Or they say, no, that's an illegal flip. So, there is still some of that out there, but, flipping, even FHA allows it after 90 days. Using my method, by the way, they allow it at the same time, simultaneously, with a closing. I'm going to go through and give you the basic idea now behind the inverse purchase. Now this is you And you'll always see one of my concepts is I'm always trying to get between two people. That's the only place, that's the only way to make money, right? Got to get between somebody, you got to get between a money source and somebody who needs the money. That's what financing is all about. All right, but if you stage this right and you get between a buyer and a seller, not only is the financing okay, and in fact we're going to give up making any money as a loan officer. I'm not even going to bring that up. I'm not even going to be a loan officer on the transaction. In fact, I haven't done a loan in years now. Well, it's been several years. I won't do them. Too much trouble. Too much work. I'll piecemeal all mine out just like I teach all my students. Let a mortgage broker do that. They've got probably 20 or 30 hours they're going to have to put into that loan. That's way too much time. All right. So what we do is we make our money by controlling that loan off to the side, but between the seller and the end buyer. Now, I call this last person an end buyer. This is the person we're going to ultimately resell to, and this is the person we're going to get financed. They're the end buyer because they're on the end. We are also a buyer because we're buying up in the front side of this transaction. So the first thing that occurs is we find a semi-motivated seller. Doesn't even have to be the true technical, traditional motivated seller that we're have all accustomed to. Oh, I'm in divorce. I must sell today, or I'm moving out of town next week. You know, here's my home. Take all my equity. We're not really looking for that. I mean, when they come along, that'll be a nice payday. But we can do so many of these deals. We're not out looking for that. We can actually put offers in to any seller on the market. Any FSBO for sale by owner is somebody we can buy a house from. Because why? If we just negotiate the price down by $5,000, we've made $5,000. We're in and out in 14 days. It's a number of hours that we're actually putting into the transaction. You add up how many hours we're working, and we're going to work it out to somewhere around $1,000 an hour profit is what we're going to be after. I've got guys making anywhere from $1,000 an hour to $5,000 an hour. So we're going to first contract to buy from a semi-motivated seller at one price. And let's make this, of course, the lower price. And let's just round this out. I'm going to use low numbers, 100,000, stuff like that, so I can do it faster in my head. We're going to resell to our end buyer at the full appraised value or the full market value, $100,000. So we've made one contract here. In making this contract, what we've done is we've become legally an owner of the home. When you go to contract with somebody and you sign on the dotted line, sales contract, there's a doctrine called Equitable Conversion. And when I first read about this, and I do my own research, I figured all this out just by accident. I just read so much law. Some people call me a bookworm, a nerd, a computer goof, or whatever. But you know what? It really has paid off well. Because when I read about equitable conversion, my mind started spinning. I said, oh my God, what do people realize what this means? When I can combine that with the title seasoning issues and the rules and seasoning issues, it opened up this floodgate. What that doctrine of law says is that the second you sign a sales contract to buy it, you become an owner in equity. And as an equitable owner, you can resell because you have picked up certain rights in the property. One of those rights is called beneficial interest. Beneficial interest is actually a legal term you can look up in Black's Law Dictionary. It says the person who has beneficial interest can take possession of the property, enjoy the property, and derive a profit from the property. Possession, enjoyment, profit. Those are the three rights that you get the second you sign a sales contract to buy a house. That's kind of weird because if you think about that, when we go out to put any investor go out and put a contract on a house, if that doctrine is in effect, what prevents us from moving in right now before we even close on the transaction? Because we legally picked it up. Well, I think if we've seen a real estate sales contract, there's always a clause in there that says possession shall not occur until funding or closing. Now you know why that statement has to be in the contract. Otherwise, legally you could move in. Now, I'm not advocating that, but this is how complicated, I guess, the laws can get if you don't understand, and why suddenly you start to understand certain clauses because of other things that are in the contract. Doctrine is never written down. It's a given by law. There's another doctrine we're all familiar with. A contract with somebody who's underage, it's invalid. You can't contract with somebody who's drunk or on drugs. It'd be invalid. That's never written in a contract. Just because it doesn't have to be, because it's a doctrine. This is the same thing. Equitable conversion, another law that can be looked up in Black Law's dictionary. Now, that's also been tested time after time in case law. But what happens is that once we pick up ownership, gives us the right now to resell. And no one can come in there and say, hey, you're acting like a real estate agent. No one can come in there and say, hey, you're acting in a agency situation with your buyer or sellers or whatever they want to claim. All right, you're an investor. You're buying, you're reselling. You have the right to make the profit. It's a legal flip. Lenders don't have a problem with it. And here's the rest of it. We've contracted to buy at one price. We've contracted now after we find a buyer, and we get them qualified through our mortgage broker, lender, or loan originator. All those terms are interactive as far as I'm concerned. Then this becomes the person we go to contract with. At that moment that we contract with them, we're going to back out of the contract that we have with both of them. We're going to kill both contracts. What happens when we kill the contract is we're going to then allow the seller to contract directly with our end buyer. This is the final contract. And this is the contract that's turned into the title company and closed on with a lender. Therefore, it has not disrupted the title. So title remained from the seller and passes directly to the end buyer, and we're never in the middle. All right, now how did we get the seller to do this? Well, we explained to the seller exactly what we're doing. I've always believed in full disclosure. Not only that, and this blows some people's mind, we're even going to tell the seller what we're going to make up front. My first meeting with a seller, I'm letting them know right up front what I make. I don't want any surprises. I don't want any seller coming back at closing and saying, what, you're making $30,000 on my home? I thought you were going to make $2. I had no idea. And you did that in 14 days? You didn't do anything. You're making $30,000. See, that's what we don't want. We had a few of that going on in the early days, and I cured it very quickly, real quick, by saying, okay, from now on, let's just disclose to them. What I found out when I went to a seller and said, I'm an investor, I've got to make money. I won't even touch your house unless I'm making $20,000. Oh, you know what, Mr. Investor? You can make as much as you want. You can make $100,000. I've had that pulled on me too. You can make $100,000. I don't care. As long as you want to pay me this amount that I need and we've agreed to, I don't care what you make. So up front, we get them committed to not having a problem with what we're making. So we don't have any, what I call, seller remorse at the closing table, because that can get nasty. So what we've done up front, we're letting the seller know, here's what we do, here's how much I'm going to make, and here's the possibilities of how this thing can actually take place. I might indeed go ahead and close with you, because again, we have the power when we sign the contract. We're owner of the property in equity. We could go ahead and close if we really wanted to. We have that right. Or we can resell it, or we can create a loan. Maybe we do an owner carryback type of thing like I mentioned earlier. We could create an owner carryback between us and the end buyer and sell that note at closing. And then pay this guy off and walk away with our profit. I mean, that's another option. There's a lot of different options, but you know what? All we're telling the seller is that we are going to resell the property. We're going to try to make about this much money on it. We're going to do it in 14 days. And if I don't do it in 14 days, you get your property back. You can continue selling it, doing whatever you might have been doing before, which we all know wasn't working, or they wouldn't be talking to us, right? So they have nothing to lose except what? Time, which is how much? We actually even know exactly how much time. Even if they try to list it with a real estate agent, you guys know it's 30 days? No. 60? No way. 3 months, 6 months, and some agents a year. They have nothing to lose. A lot of these sellers have already tried that. That's why we're talking to them. They put their house up with that newbie real estate agent who threw it in the MLS and hoped somebody else would sell it. And of course that didn't happen. And now it's just stringing along. And that payment's getting to, it's feeling, they're starting to feel it. They might even be getting pressure from the wife. Honey, you told me this would be over by now. I want my new house. All right, so we've got all these pressures happening, and some decisions will have to be made. Husband and wife comes to those terms. They like what you present. You gave them a fair offer. You gave it 14 days. They understand why you can sell it in 14 days, because we can finance people with really problem credit. And I have people waiting in line for my next house, because that's usually what's going to happen. Off your very first house that you sign up, you're going to get a number of buyers coming in. In fact, you might have, in all likelihood, I always come up with multiple people who are actually qualified to buy the house. We have to select who we're going to buy, who we're actually going to sell to. We're always going to sell to the person generally who is the best qualified, financially, credit-wise. It's safer. That's the way to do it. And so we have fallout. And we have other programs that actually pick up those fallouts, by the way, but not in this particular program. All right. So then what we do is they understand, okay, you're making this transaction, you're making this money, and potentially I could come back to you, Mr. Seller, and have you just go into contract directly, because it depends on what source my lending or what my lender source requires. And certainly I don't want to do a double closing, which would incur double closing cost. So I may come back and we just may put the two of you directly together, and I'll take my profit out of proceeds at closing. Again, no money out of the seller's pocket. It's a no-lose situation. You don't get paid unless it closes. So what we do, we back out. Our contract with our end buyer is almost the same, almost the exact same contract between me and the end buyer that they're going to sell, that they're going to actually finalize. The only thing that changes is their name, the seller's name, and usually the down payment in terms, and we'll cover that in a little bit. So that is how the transaction happens and how it occurs. Now, what we're going to do to back out of this situation and to get paid is we're going to create another contract between us and the seller. And what I've done is I just condensed this down into a invoice/release. And it's on page 44. And the invoice says, this customer in this case, the seller, agrees to pay ABC Trust, that's us, the total sum of $12,000 in exchange for the release of all rights that ABC Trust has in the subject property located at, that's our subject property address, said amount to be paid to ABC Trust from proceeds from the sale of the said property. Title closer is irrevocably instructed to pay the release at the time of closing. This locks it up, by the way. They can't pull this invoice out of closing with that verbiage in there. So all we have to do now at this point is to release our contract and to allow them to go in there, we have the seller fill that out first before we allow them to go into contract. This is all about control. So we're covered and we're protected. And if you read the terms of the invoice, that's actually a separate contract in a way. It has nothing to do in a way with this transaction anymore, because they just promised to pay us a set amount of money no matter what happens. Now, we're not going to, of course, we're not going to hold them to that if the deal doesn't go through and correct. But it helps us control the seller a little bit more should they get shaky or anything, which they usually don't. But I'm always about overcompensating and protecting my own backside. Because when you're dealing with sellers and buyers, things happen. You start out great sometimes, and it can go south very quickly. It can start out great sometimes, and you have a best friend at the end of the transaction. But we can't predict it. All right, so we've got the invoice signed to protect us. And one of the things that the seller really liked seeing as we signed this invoice was we were delivering that $1,000 or whatever earnest money check at the same time. Here you go, Mr. Seller. Here's the earnest money. We're also going to deliver a pre-approval for a loan from our mortgage broker. Here's how solid this guy is. You had no problem with me earning my money. Here's the invoice. Sign that. We're done.